Mystery Secret Searchers, Episode 24, The Fencibles. Americans charge across the river. Defenses hold at many sites. Spies, espionage, in the cold shiver. Battlefields, soldiers, cannons might. A man fades on a plank, using wood to retreat. A paddling sword is seen on a frozen river sheen. Our once curse now protects. The windmill taken, American blunders sword forsaken. Brave men of Glengarry, Americans make a final call. Their fortunes make a final fall. Well, here we are at Fort Wellington. This is in Prescott, Ontario. This is the site of one of the famous battles of the War of 1812. It's called the Battle of the Windmill. The Americans are right across the river from Upper Canada. They are invading and fighting the British at many sites through Upper Canada and Lower Canada. The Americans have just won their War of Independence with the British, and now they're moving northward into Canada. They want to take more land. Well, Fort Wellington is the site of a memorial to soldiers lost in World War I, World War II, and in the Korean War, but it's also a major site of battle in the War of 1812 with the Americans. Now, the Americans did not win this war. This war was won by the British fighting alongside the native people, and fighting alongside with these two groups were the Glengarry Fencibles, or sometimes this group is called the Canadian Fencibles. This was a militia group of men from the area. So the Glengarry militia was composed of men from the Glengarry area. Our journal writer, John MacLeod, who was in the British military, knew a lot of these men quite well and fought alongside them in the battles of 1812. Now there's the St. Lawrence River. The American side is on the far side. The Canadian side is right here. You can see how close it is and how easy it is to attack across the river and come right up on land. But our defense is held. Now, the Glengarry Fencibles is the subject of this episode. They were instrumental in helping the British, with the aid of the native peoples, fight off the Americans. And they're linked throughout Glengarry. The Glengarry Fencibles are linked to MacLeod settlement, to the Northwest Company we've talked about, to John Sandfield MacDonald, and to a place in Glengarry called Loch Garry, which will become much more important as we learn more about the travels of the cursed sword of MacLeod. Now, right now, the cursed sword of MacLeod is in America, and the Americans have it, and they're trying to attack Upper Canada, and they do a poor job. They cannot win that battle. Here's the famous windmill, the Battle of the Windmill site. It now is a lighthouse. It does not look like a windmill any longer. The Battle of the Windmill in 1838 was a bloody event in the complex struggle between the Family Compact and the Reformers for control of the British colony of Upper Canada. The Reformers, they didn't like the British much either. They wanted change. They wanted to reform. So they kind of enlisted the help of the Americans. The Americans thought, well, we can invade Canada now. They're ready for change. They want to fight the British. But that's not how it turned out. William Lyon Mackenzie was one of the best known of the Reformers. Although generally disliked by the Reform themselves, he became the voice of the Reform through his newspaper called the Colonial Advocate. There was an election between the Reformers and the backers of the British, which were called the Family Compact, in which the Reformers lost. This set the stage for the events of 1837 and 1838, which are called the Canadian Rebellion, which endangered the survival of Upper Canada as a British colony. Mackenzie and his followers fled across the border into New York State, and their escape produced a more serious danger to the colony than their attempt at rebellion. Many Americans were convinced that the Canadian colonists were ready to overthrow British rule and recreate a republic kind of like the Americans had. So they found themselves, the Americans, ready to attack Canada, to take over. From the moment these radicals arrived in America, they found themselves the focus of a lot of anti-British sentiment, and their presence became the catalyst for the creation of a secret organization whose members were known as Hunters. In New York State alone, it is believed that there were 283 different Hunters lodges, and these were established with over 20,000 members. Upper Canada was ready for attack. Downstream from Prescott, but within sight of the town of Prescott and Fort Wellington, the stone windmill that became the focus of the Battle of the Windmill in November 1838 still stands. 60 feet in height with thick rubble stone walls, it was in the midst of a tiny little hamlet called Newport, containing about a dozen buildings. The windmill itself is atop a tall, steep slope which rises 30 feet above the river. The goal of the invaders was Prescott, but the element of surprise that they needed for success was no longer possible. On Monday, November the 12th, a suspicious vessel was spotted heading towards shore, and an alarm bell was sounded to bring out the population for defense of their town, forcing the nighttime invaders to flee to the safety of American waters. They were not, however, disheartened by this initial failure. Convinced that once they landed on British soil, they would be joined by countless discontented Canadians, they picked another landing spot, the Windmill Point. The initial attempt at invasion had been a fiasco. The events that unfolded at Windmill Point were bloody and tragic. The invaders numbered about 250 men, with the expectations that reinforcements would add considerably to their numbers. They were well equipped with rifles and artillery, enough ammunition for 4 or 5 days of fighting. On November 13th, the British authorities quickly moved upon receiving the news of the invasion, gathering together in Prescott a small force of militia and regular troops. Early on Tuesday morning, the guns of the steamers opened fire on the windmill, and it was evident that their armament was not up to the task of seriously damaging the structure. By 9 o'clock, the British troops, numbering 600, were on the move. The British thought they would have an easy victory, but the Hunters proved them wrong. The fighting went on for hours, at which time the British withdrew their force, leaving the Hunters still in control of the windmill. A later report stated that 13 soldiers were killed and 78 wounded, and the Hunters were thought to have lost 18. On November 14th and 15th, the Hunters had succeeded in successfully fending off the British attack, but their situation was precarious. They had suffered now more losses. Their supplies of ammunition and food were almost gone. All they could do now was sit and wait for the return of the British troops. No support was coming from Canada. On Friday, November the 16th, the windmill was taken. The British had their second attack, and they took the windmill, thus ending basically the Canadian Rebellion of 1837-1838. Now, the images we're looking at now are of Fraser Field. Fraser Field was a house built in Glengarry by Colonel Alexander Fraser, and he commanded the Glengarry militia during the Canadian Rebellion of 1837 and 1838, and he had much to do with its suppression. This is a historic place of interest and beauty in Glengarry. Now, Colonel Alexander Fraser was commanded by Sir John Colborne. He was also a friend of Bishop Alexander McDonell, and he was an acquaintance of our journal writer, John MacLeod. Colonel Fraser belonged to a family that had come to Canada from Scotland and settled in the township of Charlottenburg, which is near the Raisin River in South Glengarry. While out in the War of 1812, he served as a quartermaster in the Canadian Fencibles. When that period of hostilities was ended, and it seemed safe to do so, Fraser settled on a very large farm in Glengarry and built this house called Fraser Field. So he was in charge of the Canadian and the Glengarry Fencibles. This house was built sometime around 1812 and still stands in Glengarry. Now, what is the significance of all of this? Well, we're able to link the Glengarry Fencibles and lots of other areas in Glengarry, but this all links to our journal writer, John MacLeod. John MacLeod is following the path that the cursed sword of the Clan MacLeod is taking. And when the British lost in America, the Americans seemed to find the sword, but it then cursed them. All these battles of 1812 and the Canadian Rebellion of 1838, the Americans trying to invade Canada, well, many attacks from the Americans into Upper and Lower Canada, but all of them fail. They all fail. And the Americans lose. The Americans were in possession of the sword during this time. But the sword has made its way back into Upper Canada. Glengarry prospered during a period of time when the sword was not there, when the sword was in America. Once the sword came back and got back into Upper Canada, then the curse took its hold again. But for now, the times are good in Glengarry. The war is over. The Americans have been repelled. Settlements are springing up all over Glengarry.